Welcome to episode 9 in our story of the Norman Conquest of Ireland. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who's been listening so far. The podcast has continued to grow across Spotify, Apple and Audible, and don't forget video accompanies the Spotify version of the podcast. If you're enjoying the series, I'd be very grateful if you could follow the podcast, leave a rating or share with somebody who might be interested in Irish history. It really does help the podcast reach more people. In the previous episode, we followed one of the most dramatic moments in the early Norman invasion, Rory O'Connor's siege of Dublin. Rory had led a grand coalition of Gaelic tribes to drive out the Normans, and they surrounded the city with a huge army. The Song of Dermot and the Earl claimed 30,000, but this is likely an exaggerated figure. It's more likely somewhere between 5 to 10,000, which would have been more typical of the era. The siege put the Normans under pressure, and Strongbow's situation became desperate. Food was running short, no reinforcements or supplies were coming, and while the city was surrounded, news arrived that Robert FitzStephen had been taken prisoner in Wexford. After a failed attempt to negotiate, the Normans launched a sudden attack from Dublin. Milo de Cogan led the 1st Division, Raymond le Gros followed, and the sortie caught the besieging forces by surprise, and the Irish coalition was scattered. Dublin had survived, but the Norman position was far from secure. And that's where we pick up the story today. Strongbow had broken Rory O'Connor's siege, but he had no time to enjoy this victory. The news from Wexford was too serious to ignore. Robert FitzStephen was still a prisoner, and Wexford was in rebel hands. One of the most important Norman footholds in Ireland had slipped out of his control. So Strongbow turned his attention south. Now remember, Robert FitzStephen is no minor figure. He'd been one of the first Norman leaders to come to Ireland in 1169. He'd landed at Bannow Bay, helped capture Wexford, and played the major role in the opening phase of Dermot MacMurrough's return to power. He is one of the men who had made the Norman intervention in Ireland possible, but by 1171 his position in Wexford had become vulnerable. According to the Song of Dermot and the Earl, FitzStephen had sent 36 of his best men to help Strongbow in Dublin, but this weakened his own position in Wexford. With his own forces reduced, the men of Wexford rose against him. The details vary slightly depending on the source, but the broad outline is clear. FitzStephen withdrew to a defensive position, usually identified with being a castle or some kind of stronghold. According to later summaries, he was persuaded to surrender after being falsely told that Dublin had fallen to Rory O'Connor, and FitzStephen, believing that no help or no reinforcements were on the way, thought his situation hopeless and agreed to surrender. But Dublin, as we know, had not fallen, and Strongbow had broken the siege. Once Strongbow learned what had happened in Wexford, he moved quickly. He left Dublin and marched south. Strongbow controlled important towns, but he did not control all the countryside between them. Moving from Dublin to Wexford was not just simply a peaceful journey through friendly territory. He was travelling through a landscape where local rulers were blocking passes, cutting off movement and attacking his force. According to the Song of Dermot and the Earl, as Strongbow moved south, he encountered resistance in an area that's close to modern-day Carlow. The source describes an attack or attempted ambush by the Orions, who tried to block Strongbow's passage. Strongbow fought his way through and continued towards Wexford, but he arrived too late. By the time Strongbow reached the area, the Wexford men refused to hand FitzStephen over. According to the song, they withdrew with him to an island just off the coast of Wexford, and they threatened to kill him if Strongbow attempted a rescue. The same source also states that Wexford was burned as they withdrew. This placed Strongbow in a very difficult position. He'd marched south to rescue one of his most important allies, but now found himself unable to act. The Wexford men had moved FitzStephen beyond immediate reach, and any attempt to force the issue might lead to his execution. So Strongbow accepted failure and withdrew his forces. Donal Cavanagh, Dermot's son, remains as one of Strongbow's key Irish allies at this point. However, Strongbow realised he'd need even more allies if he was to survive Ireland. Strongbow aimed to divide the Gaelic coalition and also reassert his own authority. He set his target on Gilpatrick of Ossory. Strongbow rode towards Waterford and sent sealed letters to Donal Mór O'Brien, King of Thomond, asking him to come to Ossory with his forces to march against Gilpatrick. Donal answered the Norman lord's offer and came with a large force, and Strongbow went to meet him, and together they had about 2,000 men between them. Ossory sat in a strategically important position between Leinster and Munster, roughly corresponding to much of modern-day Kilkenny. Whoever controlled or influenced Ossory could affect movement between Waterford, Leinster, Munster and the interior. So for Strongbow, dealing with Ossory was not simply a matter of punishment, he was trying to stabilise his claim to Leinster. And this is where Donal Mór O'Brien's involvement becomes particularly interesting. Only weeks earlier, Donal had been part of Rory O'Connor's coalition outside Dublin. He was standing against Strongbow. Now he was answering Strongbow's letters and joining him in a campaign against Ossory, proving the Gaelic coalition built by Rory O'Connor was very fragile. O'Brien will change sides multiple times during his life and will be one of the few Gaelic leaders that will outlive most around him. He was the king of Thomond. Like every major ruler in this period, he was looking for his own advantage and to further his own aims. If cooperation with Strongbow allowed him to weaken Ossory and extend his influence eastwards, then so be it. There was also a family connection. Donal Mór O'Brien was married to Orla, a daughter of Dermot MacMurrough, just as Strongbow was married to Aoife, another daughter of Dermot MacMurrough. The song of Dermot and the Earl makes this point directly, saying that King O'Brien and Earl Richard had married two sisters, both daughters of Dermot. MacDonald Gilpatrick, the King of Ossory, quickly realised the danger. He sent a messenger to Strongbow seeking terms. He wanted Maurice De Prendergast to guarantee his safety. Remember, De Prendergast had a previous connection with Ossory. Earlier in the invasion, after falling out with Dermot MacMurrough, Maurice had entered the service of MacGilpatrick. He'd even become known as Maurice of Ossory because of the time he spent there. So when MacGilpatrick looked for someone who might guarantee his safety in Strongbow's camp, Maurice was the obvious choice. Maurice agreed, rode out, and took MacGilpatrick under his protection. However, Donal Mór O'Brien sent many of his men across Ossory to plunder, and in order to protect MacGilpatrick, Maurice de Prendergast has to intervene, and he slays several warriors from Thomond. According to the song, Maurice killed 9 or 10 men as he escorted the King of Ossory to safety. However, 9 or 10 men is probably an exaggeration. It's most likely that Donal Mór O'Brien would have been angry by this. Maurice defended his actions by offering his glove as a pledge, promising to answer for whatever offence he committed, but the other Norman barons stood by Maurice de Prendergast's actions. But what this episode tells us is that the Normans were not operating as one united bloc. Maurice de Prendergast fought alongside the Normans. He also served Irish rulers, protected the King of Ossory, and killed some of the men of Donal Mór O'Brien, all within this same turbulent period. It's likely that Maurice de Prendergast was driven by a mixture of loyalty, self-interest, personal honour, and some form of political opportunism. The captured King of Ossory surrendered to the Normans and agreed to become a vassal of Strongbow. However, Strongbow was still trying to impose order on a kingdom that had not fully accepted him. But now he would face an even greater political problem: Henry II. King Henry had been watching events in Ireland with growing alarm. Strongbow was his subject. He was a powerful lord with long-standing difficulties in Wales and England, and now he was building his own major kingdom in Ireland. From Henry's point of view, this was dangerous. He had not authorised him to become an independent ruler. However, Strongbow has now taken the towns of Waterford, Wexford and Dublin. Furthermore, he has married Aoife MacMurrough and claimed the Kingdom of Leinster. And he somehow has managed to survive not one but 2 attacks on Dublin, the first by Askell MacTurkle and the second by Rory O'Connor. That made Strongbow both useful and threatening. Useful because he'd now opened a door into Ireland. Threatening because he might try to keep that door for himself. Henry II had spent much of his reign strengthening the royal authority and limiting the independence of his great barons. So Henry moved to bring the situation under royal control. Strongbow crossed to England and met Henry at Pembroke, where the two men negotiated a compromise. Strongbow had been sending emissaries to King Henry II for some time, and eventually Henry II agreed to receive him. This was still a huge leap of faith for Strongbow. By travelling to Wales, he could have easily been arrested or even executed for his earlier actions. However, the meeting does seem to go well. Strongbow needed reconciliation. He defied his king, but he also needed Henry II. He could not hold Ireland without reinforcements. Henry II also had reasons to compromise. If Henry crushed Strongbow, he might lose the gains already made in Ireland under his name. Strongbow and the other Norman lords had done something Henry himself had not done yet. They'd taken and held major towns in Ireland. They'd secured Dublin, Waterford and Wexford, and they'd created an opportunity for him. Henry's challenge was to take control of that opportunity without allowing Strongbow to become too powerful. The compromise seems to have worked roughly like this. Strongbow was restored to royal favour, but he had to surrender key places and authority to Henry. The towns, Dublin, Waterford and Wexford, would come under royal control, while Strongbow would retain substantial rights in Leinster, but not as king, but as a lord. So Strongbow never becomes king of Leinster, and that's really important. He will become the Lord of Leinster. So this is important because this shows that Strongbow sacrifices his royal ambition in return for favour from King Henry II, and to gain all of the supplies, support and men to complete his conquest of Leinster. Up to this point, the invasion of Ireland had been driven by private adventurers. FitzStephen wanted land and reward, Maurice Fitzgerald wanted opportunity, Strongbow wanted power and wealth and perhaps to build his own kingdom, but now the King of England was taking command of the situation. And this changes the whole character of the invasion. And in the next episode, we'll follow Henry II as he lands in Ireland, receives submissions from the Irish kings and churchmen, takes control of Norman towns and begins to turn a private invasion into a royal occupation. The age of the English crown in Ireland is about to begin. Thanks for listening, and please follow and rate the podcast if you can. Thanks again. Bye.